eliminate that threat.
I'm asking a more specific question because in your testimony, you suggest that you would use force to compel cooperation, for instance, with oil sales. Do you agree that you have to come to Congress to get authorization if you were simply using force to try to compel cooperation?
Well, there's two things. There's the
it seems like
under the War Powers Act. No, under the War Powers Act, if we're going to be involved in something that's going to put us in there involved in.
Right out of the gate, you need to understand something. This hearing wasn't calm, it wasn't polite, and it definitely wasn't controlled by the witness. From the very first minute, you can feel Senator Chris Murphy shifting the temperature in the room. He isn't there to nod politely or accept vague promises. He's there to corner Senator Marco Rubio on the record. And Rubio knows it. Watch the dynamic closely. Murphy isn't rambling, he's stacking. Each point he makes isn't just a question, it's a pressure point. First, he hits Rubio on the seizure and sale of Venezuelan oil, calling out the uncomfortable truth: the U.S. is taking oil at gunpoint, moving it offshore, controlling the revenue, and somehow we're supposed to believe this is the foundation of a democratic transition. That alone puts Rubio on his heels. Then, Murphy tightens the screws. He doesn't let Rubio coast on diplomatic generalities. He exposes the no-bid licenses, the donor connections, the complete lack of a timeline, the absence of progress, the political prisoners still silenced, the main opposition leader still in exile, all of it. Each sentence lands like he's dragging a spotlight across a stage Rubio has tried to keep dim. You can practically see Rubio's internal alarm switch from explain to contain. Pay attention to Murphy's structure. He ends his opening with 3 direct questions, and each one is a trap with no clean exit. 1. Can Rubio commit to an open, fair bidding process for future oil partners? 2. If the unelected hardliner Delcy Rodriguez is still in power 6 months from now, is that failure? 3. Under what conditions would Rubio consider military force, and does he admit Congress would have to authorize it? These are not how's the weather? Questions. These are accountability questions, the kind that don't allow wiggle room. And Rubio immediately tries to create wiggle room anyway. That's why this hearing gets so volatile. Rubio keeps insisting everything is temporary. Everything is just a short-term fix. Everything is moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I think the scope of the project that you are undertaking in Venezuela is without precedent. You are taking their oil at gunpoint. You are holding and selling that oil, putting for now the receipts in an offshore Middle Eastern account. You're deciding how and for what purposes that money is going to be used in a country of 30 million people. I think a lot of us believe that that is destined for failure. And I know that you're telling us today just to be patient, but a month later, we have no information on a timetable for a democratic transition. Maduro's people are still in charge. Most of the political prisoners are in jail. And by the way, those that have been let out have a gag order on them from the government. The opposition leader is still in exile. This looks already like it is a failure. You say you're in serious talks, but as you note, the Venezuelans are great at being in serious talks. They almost never deliver. So I'm just going to give you my 3 questions and hope that you'll answer them, because I do think we want to try to understand how to judge the efficacy of this as time goes on, because I worry you won't be back before this committee anytime soon, and to understand whether this is just facilitating corruption, both in Venezuela and here at home. So here are my 3 questions. First, reports are that you've given no-bid licenses to 2 companies to sell Venezuela's oil. One of them is a massive donor to the president. To many Americans, that reeks. And so my question is, can you commit that partners for future sales are going to be chosen through a fair, open selection process? Second, if Delcy Rodriguez, who is an unelected leader, the head of Maduro's torture operation, is still in power 6 months from now, does that mean that your policy is a success or failure? How do we judge when we've had enough of Rodriguez? And third, in your testimony, you reserved the right to use force again in the future if the Venezuelan government isn't complying with your requests. So if, for instance, they refused to give you access to the oil in the future, if they said, we're just going to keep it for ourselves, Would this cause you to consider military action? And do you concede that if you're using military action simply to try to compel cooperation from the government, you absolutely need congressional authorization for that? So if you can answer those three questions.
So the first question was about the trading company.
Okay, pause right there. Because what we just watched isn't a simple line of questioning, it's a live demonstration of political momentum flipping. Look at how Murphy frames the entire situation. He positions Rubio as the architect of a risky, unprecedented operation in Venezuela. And not just risky, inherently unstable. Murphy drops phrases like taking their oil at gunpoint and destined for failure, and Rubio doesn't contest those descriptions. That silence is telling. When a senator doesn't push back on the moral framing of his own policy, he's already losing the narrative. Murphy also does something essential for control. He predicts Rubio's defense before Rubio can give it. He says, essentially, "You're going to tell us to be patient, but nothing is happening." That's devastating, because it steals Rubio's fallback argument before he gets to use it. By the time Rubio answers, anything he says about ongoing talks or short-term difficulties will sound like exactly the empty excuses Murphy pre-framed. And let's talk about those three questions. The first one, the no-bid contracts, is a hit with teeth. Murphy doesn't accuse Rubio of corruption. He forces Rubio to confront the optics. That's how real pressure works. He brings up donors. He brings up secrecy. He puts Rubio in a position where any answer other than a clear commitment looks like a dodge. And Rubio knows it. The second question is even sharper. If the unelected hardliner running Maduro's torture apparatus is still in power in 6 months, is this policy a failure? That's not hypothetical. That's a deadline. Murphy is demanding a metric for success, and Rubio has zero interest in being pinned to one, because metrics can be measured, and measured failures stick. Then the third question hits like a hammer. Would you consider military action simply to force cooperation on oil access? And if so, doesn't Congress have to authorize it? That is not a small question. That's a constitutional line in the sand question. Murphy is essentially forcing Rubio to admit two things at once. One, that military force is on the table even for economic compliance. Two, that Rubio can't legally do it without Congress. You can feel the air tighten in the room. It's the kind of moment where witnesses often try to blur their language, and that blur becomes the story. Now remember, Rubio is the one who wanted this Venezuela strategy seen as bold, decisive, unprecedented. Murphy is turning that boldness into liability. From here on out, Rubio isn't setting the pace anymore. He's reacting. He's trying to justify temporary shortcuts, temporary workarounds, temporary exceptions, all of which make the strategy look even less stable. In the next clip, where we jump further into Rubio's answers, this dynamic becomes crystal clear. Because once Murphy gets Rubio talking about timelines, force authorizations, and how many times he's calling Venezuelan officials each week, you can actually watch Rubio start hedging in real time.
So the first question was about the trading companies. The second is about Delcy still in power 6 months from now.
6 months from now.
And the third is on the use of force.
Yes.
Okay. On the first one, the two traders. So here's the problem we faced. The problem we faced in the short term is they had no place to put oil. They were running out of storage capacity for their oil. We had to move that oil to market very quickly. The only way to move it to market very quickly is to plug into these two primary trade companies that could sell it in the open market. That is not the permanent outcome here. That is a short-term fix to a short-term problem, which is they were literally storing oil. They brought in tankers and had tankers sitting offshore just to hold their oil. At some point, their capacity to produce was going to be shut down and their ability to generate revenue. So we had to move that oil very quickly. The long-term plan is not those two trading companies. The long-term plan is for them to have a normal energy program that sells directly into the market, directly, to refineries and to companies that are exploiting and exploring it. For example, Chevron has operations there that never stopped. They seek to expand those operations. They don't need those trading companies. So those trading companies were a short-term fix for a very acute problem because we wanted to prevent societal collapse because they had no money for revenue. On the second point about her being still in power, look, let me say this, a couple things. This is not unprecedented. I can point to a number of places, Spain, Paraguay, 2 examples of places in which there was a transition, from an autocratic regime to a democratic regime, and it took time. I can't give you a timeline of how long it takes. It can't take forever. It's not even been 4 weeks since Maduro was reduced.
A year, two
Well, I think
years?
we need to be, let me put it to you this way, we need to be much further along 6 months from now, even 3 months from now. That may not be satisfactory to you, but I'm saying we have to be much further along 3, 4, 5 months. 3 or 4, 5 months from now cannot look like what today looks like. And I think there's acknowledgement on both sides of that. I can probably give you a better answer, and this is not deflecting, when we finally have people on the ground like the ambassador and the team around her on a daily basis that are interacting. Because one thing is for me to pick up the phone and talk to Delcy Rodriguez 3 times a week. Another thing is to have someone on the ground on a daily basis that's following these events, is talking to civil society, but also engaging with interim authorities. But the fact of the matter is that, yes, we want to see quick progress. As you said, it's unprecedented, okay? All I'm saying to you is, before this was stagnant. Before this, we had spent 14 years, you were involved in some of those efforts, 14 years trying to change the dynamic in Venezuela. 13, 12, 11, 10, it was a big part of my career in the Senate was spent on this. This is the first time in over a decade that we see even the glimmer of an opportunity to change conditions. A lot of that will depend on us, but a lot of that will depend on them. And it also will depend on the rest of Venezuelan society. How quickly can we get all these Venezuelans that want to go back to Venezuela and participate in civic and economic life back to Venezuela? That's going to be critical here. We recognize that. So yes, we have to be much further along in 6 months. We expect to be further along. And if we're not, I'll tell you. We'll tell you. On the third point of use of force, look, the president never rules out his options as commander-in-chief to protect the national interest of the United States. I can tell you right now with full certainty, we are not postured to, nor do we intend or expect to have to take any military action in Venezuela at any time. The only military presence you'll see in Venezuela is our Marine Guards at an embassy. Okay, that is our goal, that is our expectation, and that is what everything that outlines towards.
But if
that said, if an Iranian drone factory pops up and threatens our forces in the region, the president retains the option to eliminate that threat.
I'm asking a more specific question because in your testimony, you suggest that you would use force to compel cooperation, for instance, with oil sales. Do you agree that you have to come to Congress to get authorization if you are simply using force to try to compel cooperation?
Well, there's 2 things. There's the
it seems like
under the War Powers Act. No, under the War Powers Act, if we're going to be involved in something that's going to put us involved in a sustained way, we have to notify you within 48 hours after the fact, and then if it's going to last longer than 60 days, we have to come to Congress with it. We don't anticipate either of these things having to happen. Everything is moving in a very different trajectory right now. On the other hand, if we tell them we don't want to see drones from Iran, as an example, pointed at the United States or threatening our forces or our presence in the region or our allies' presence in the region, and they refuse to comply with that, the president does reserve the option in self-defense to eliminate that threat. We don't see that. We don't anticipate it. But it could happen. But we hope not. We don't want it to happen. On the contrary, if we had to take military action, it would set us back on all these other things that we're talking about. I can tell you military action is not good for recovery and transition. That's not what we hope to see. It's certainly not our goal here. But a lot of that will depend on them. But I think it would require the emergence of an imminent threat of the kind that we do not anticipate.
And that is the unraveling. Because once Rubio starts answering, the contradictions in his strategy spill into the open. Let's start with his defense of the no-bid contracts. His entire justification boils down to, we had no choice, we had to move fast. But think about what that means. Murphy challenged him on transparency and fairness, and Rubio responds with urgency, not openness. That's not an answer, that's damage control. And audiences pick up on that instantly. Then Rubio insists that everything he's describing is temporary. The offshore accounts, the controlled oil sales, the reliance on 2 giant traders. But temporary programs in foreign policy have a funny way of becoming permanent fixtures. Murphy didn't even have to point that out. Rubio's own explanation makes it obvious. When a senator starts labeling every major structural decision as short-term, it signals improvisation, not strategy. Then comes the timeline question, and this is where Rubio loses the room. Murphy asked for clarity. If the same authoritarian figures remain in place 6 months from now, is this a failure? Rubio refuses to give a straight answer. Instead, he says we need to be much further along, but also that he can't give a timeline, but also that it can't take forever, but also that it's only been 4 weeks. That's not a plan. That's a fog. Viewers at home feel that. They don't need to be Venezuela experts. They just know when a politician is tap dancing. Now watch what Rubio does next. He leans heavily on phone calls. He mentions calling Delcy Rodriguez multiple times a week. He talks about needing people on the ground. He talks about civil society. But none of that answers Murphy's actual question. What does success look like? And when do we admit the strategy failed? When you use 500 words to avoid answering a 10-word question, that's not strength, that's evasion. And then we reach the powder keg, the military force section. Here's why the moment from the cold open matters so much. Murphy pushes Rubio to recognize a bright red constitutional line. You cannot use military action just to compel compliance on oil access without authorization from Congress. Rubio tries to shift the discussion to drones, to regional threats, to hypothetical dangers, anything but the actual question. That move is classic when someone doesn't want to commit on the record, but Murphy keeps bringing him back. We're not talking about self-defense. We're talking about compelling cooperation. Notice how Rubio's tone changes. He starts running sentences together. He talks about the War Powers Act in generalities. He says he doesn't anticipate the need. That's not confidence. That's retreat. And this is the heart of the confrontation. Murphy isn't letting Rubio define the conversation on broad foreign policy abstractions. He forces Rubio to stay inside the box of the specific policy Rubio himself created. And Rubio keeps trying to claw his way out. From that point on, Rubio is no longer defending a coherent strategy. He's managing fallout, trying to soften implications he himself introduced in his testimony. The more he talks, the weaker the footing becomes. Every reassurance he gives only highlights how unstable the underlying policy is. This is why this hearing hits so hard. Murphy exposed the core issues. No transparency. No clear benchmarks. No consistent legal theory. No timeline. No measurable success conditions, and Rubio never recovered. In political hearings, control is everything. Whoever defines the frame defines the outcome. Rubio walked in wanting to show leadership. Murphy walked in determined to show accountability. And the transcript makes something very clear. Murphy won the frame. Rubio spent the entire hearing reacting, adjusting, retreating, never once regaining command of the narrative. That's the real story here, not just the policy tension, not just the legal ambiguity, but the shift in power during the hearing itself. Murphy didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He didn't monologue. He did something far more devastating. He boxed Rubio in with specifics. And Rubio answered with vagueness. In hearings, that contrast is fatal. The more Rubio insisted everything was temporary and unprecedented, the more it sounded like he was improvising justification for a strategy that already looked shaky. And when Murphy forced him to confront the question of military authorization, Rubio couldn't give a clean yes or a clean no.